Right now, somewhere in America, a Christian woman over 50 just opened her eyes at 3:47 a.m. with her heart racing and her soul screaming a truth she's too afraid to say out loud during daylight hours. She loves God more than ever and feels emptier than ever. She's served faithfully for decades, and now she's drowning in the exact ministry that was supposed to save her. Here's the paradox: nobody tells you about spiritual maturity. The thing that got you here, grinding, performing, proving your faithfulness through constant availability. The exact thing that will kill you if you don't learn to stop. But there's another way. It's called soul flowing, the biblical rhythm of rest that transforms grinding into flowing, exhaustion into overflow, and survival into the sacred second act God intended for your 50s, 60s, and beyond. This isn't another program. This isn't 10 steps to a better quiet time. This is the ancient practice that Jesus modeled, that saved Margaret's life at 58, and that's now transforming Christian women over 50 who were secretly dying while everyone applauded their faithfulness. If you're a Christian woman over 50 who wakes at 3 a.m. wondering if God forgot your purpose, if your chest tightens with anxiety you can't name, if you're serving from fumes while everyone applauds your strength, this story is your permission slip to stop dying and start living. This is Margaret's journey from burned out to quietly radiant, from church parking lot breakdown to 5 a.m. breakthrough, from grinding for God to flowing with Him. And it starts exactly where you are right now, exhausted, honest, and brave enough to admit the performance isn't working anymore. Her story begins on a Sunday morning she'll never forget, the morning her body finally said what her mouth couldn't. The leather steering wheel was slick beneath Margaret's palms, not from rain, but from the kind of sweat that comes when your body knows something your mind refuses to admit. It was 10:47 a.m. on a Sunday in October, and the church bells were ringing their third call, the sound vibrating through the windshield like a judgment she could feel in her chest. The parking lot was emptying, families disappearing through the red double doors she'd walked through every Sunday for 32 years. But this morning, at 58 years old, Margaret Ann Robertson sat frozen in her late husband's Buick, unable to move. Her phone buzzed, Sarah's text, "Mom, you coming in? Saving you a seat." She should move. She loved God. She loved this church. But somewhere between should and move, her body had staged a quiet rebellion. And for the first time in 2 years, she said out loud what she'd been too terrified to admit. "I can't do this anymore." This wasn't grief anymore. Margaret knew grief had counseled it, survived it when David's heart stopped at 60. This was something else entirely. The slow erosion of a soul that had been giving, serving, and performing strength for so long that the actual faith had leaked out. She was a lighthouse with no light inside, still standing, still guiding others while her own foundation crumbled in darkness. And here's what nobody tells Christian women over 50. You can love God with your whole heart and still feel absolutely nothing. What Margaret didn't know, yet sitting in that parking lot with mascara tracking down her face, was that there's a name for what she'd lost and a way to find it again. People who understood these things called it soul flowing. But first, she'd have to stop. Margaret released the steering wheel and placed both hands over her heart, feeling it pound like something caged and frantic. She closed her eyes and did the only honest thing she'd done in months. She told God the truth. "I'm empty," she whispered. "I love you, and I'm completely empty." No lightning struck. No peace descended. But something infinitesimal shifted, like the first crack in ice before the thaw. By the time Sarah found her 20 minutes later, Margaret had stopped crying and started breathing again. She went inside. She smiled. She did all the things she'd been doing. But Tuesday at 3:47 a.m., when her eyes snapped open in darkness for the 47th night in a row, something else snapped too. And that's when the real breaking began. The bathroom tile was ice against Margaret's bare feet at 3:47 a.m., the fluorescent bulb buzzing overhead like an insect trapped in glass. She stood at the sink in David's old robe, the navy terry cloth one she hadn't washed in 2 years because it still held the ghost of his Old Spice and morning coffee. Her reflection stared back, but the woman looking out was a stranger. Hollow eyes, gray roots she kept meaning to cover. a face that looked carved rather than lived in. This was the 47th consecutive morning her body had jolted awake at exactly 3:47 a.m., pulled from sleep by an alarm clock that didn't exist. This wasn't insomnia, she could fall asleep just fine. This was waking to something, though she couldn't name what. Last week she'd slept 8 hours and woke exhausted. Yesterday she'd slept 10 and woke even worse. Her doctor said perimenopause. Her daughter said grief. But standing in the 3:47 a.m. bathroom light, Margaret knew the truth. This was soul depletion. The kind of tired sleep doesn't fix because sleep isn't the deficit. Margaret turned on the faucet and splashed cold water on her face, watching drops fall into the white porcelain basin. Each drop felt like a small deathing, other piece of herself washing away. She'd Googled it last week at 4 a.m. Christian exhaustion that won't go away. The results were full of articles about burnout and self-care, but none addressed the specific terror of being a mature woman of faith who'd done everything right and still felt completely wrong. She'd raised her children in the church, buried her husband with dignity, served on every committee, counseled every struggling soul, and somewhere in the machinery of faithfulness, she'd become a function instead of a person. What she didn't know, what she couldn't see in that bathroom mirror at 3:47 a.m. was that this exhaustion wasn't her failure. It was an invitation. Her soul was screaming for something the church had forgotten to teach. The difference between grinding for God and flowing with Him. She opened her phone with shaking hands and typed, "Why do I wake up at 3:47 every morning?" The results were clinical circadian rhythms, cortisol spikes, anxiety disorders. Nothing about the soul. But the 40th result was a blog post titled The 3:47 Phenomenon. When your soul keeps better time than your clock. Margaret clicked. The first line made her hands still. If you're waking at 3:47 a.m., your soul isn't broken. It's trying to tell you something you've been too busy to hear during daylight hours. She bookmarked it, closed the phone. Tomorrow, she told herself, she'd read it. But tomorrow at 3:47 a.m., Margaret was going to say out loud the 3 words that every Christian woman over 50 has thought, but has been too terrified to confess. And once spoken, those words would change everything. The kitchen was dark, except for the blue glow of the digital clock on the microwave. 4:03 a.m. Margaret stood barefoot on the linoleum, the coffee maker gurgling its morning ritual, filling the silence with sound that felt almost companionable. She'd given up trying to go back to sleep after 3:47. 16 minutes of staring at the ceiling was enough. She wrapped both hands around the warm mug and walked to the window overlooking the backyard where David had planted rose bushes she'd let go wild. And then, to the empty room, to the darkness, to God or the absence of God or whatever was listening. Margaret whispered the words that had been clawing at her throat for 6 months. "I love you. So why do I feel nothing?" The guilt hit immediately. Good Christians don't say things like that. Mature women of faith don't question. She set the mug down hard, coffee sloshing. "I didn't mean that," she said louder. But she did mean it. She loved God truly, desperately loved Him, and felt absolutely nothing when she prayed. Her friend Janet always talked about feeling God's presence, and Margaret wanted to scream how. But instead she smiled and kept the terrible secret. Active faith, dead heart. Margaret sank into the kitchen chair and let the truth she'd been outrunning finally catch her. She was serving God. She was serving Him with everything she had, but she wasn't sitting with Him anymore. When did the relationship become a job description? She could pinpoint the exact committees she served on, the exact women she mentored, the exact Bible studies she led. But she couldn't remember the last time she'd simply sat in His presence without an agenda, without a to-do list, without the crushing weight of proving she was still useful at 58. Somewhere between David's funeral and her last birthday, she'd traded intimacy for productivity. And here's what nobody tells you about finding purpose after 50. If that purpose is built on performance, it will hollow you out from the inside. What Margaret couldn't articulate yet was that she wasn't broken. She'd just been grinding against God's rhythm instead of flowing with it. The exhaustion wasn't punishment. It was a withdrawal symptom from a presence she'd replaced with projects. The voice of wasted years chose that moment to strike. You're 58. This is your purpose now. Quiet service. Faithful endurance. Stop being dramatic. Margaret closed her eyes against it, but the voice was relentless. David's gone. The kids are gone. Your best years are gone. This emptiness is just what the second half looks like. Get used to it. She gripped the coffee mug so hard her knuckles went white. Was that true? Was this just what maturity looked like? Faith without feeling. Service without soul. Every magazine article about women her age talked about reinvention and new chapters. But they never addressed this specific paralysis. Loving God and feeling abandoned by Him at the same time. But Margaret, at 58, exhausted, empty, honest for the first time in years, was about to discover she'd been asking the wrong question. The question wasn't, why do I feel nothing? The question was, what have I been doing that's drained everything? And the answer had a name, a face, and a calendar full of everyone else's emergencies but her own soul. Tuesday morning, Margaret's phone chimed 14 times before she'd even finished her first cup of coffee. Calendar alerts, text messages, email notifications each, one a small claim on her day, her energy, her existence. She pulled up her calendar app and stared at the grid of color-coded commitments. Purple for church committee meetings, blue for grief counseling sessions, green for volunteering, yellow for family obligations. Every single slot from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. was filled for the next 3 weeks. Her name appeared 47 times across those days. Margaret leading, Margaret coordinating, Margaret mentoring, Margaret covering someone else's shift. But nowhere in that kaleidoscope of service did she see a single block that said, Margaret rests or Margaret exists as something other than the answer to everyone else's prayers. She was the church's grief counselor, ironic, since her own grief had calcified into something she couldn't name. She was the women's ministry coordinator, Sarah's emotional backup parent, the rock everyone leaned on, and nobody seemed to notice the rock was crumbling. Margaret scrolled through her text messages, and a pattern emerged that made her stomach clench. Janet. Margaret, can you take my Tuesday slot? Pastor Tom, we really need you to lead the new grief group. Rebecca, you're the only one who understands. Can we talk? Every message positioned her as indispensable, irreplaceable, the spiritual superhero who never said no. And she'd worn that cape proudly for years. But at 58, after burying David, after watching her children scatter across the country, after 2 years of waking at 3:47 a.m. with her soul screaming, Margaret finally saw the trap. She'd become the answer to everyone's prayers except her own. The church needed her productivity. Her family needed her stability. The community needed her wisdom. But Margaret needed someone to tell her it was okay to stop performing spiritual productivity and start actually living. She needed permission to discover that finding purpose after 50 wasn't about doing more. It was about being more fully herself, even if herself looked nothing like the woman everyone expected her to be. Her phone buzzed again. Sarah, Mom, you're doing too much. This isn't healthy. Margaret stared at the message, her daughter's concern glowing on the screen like an accusation. The irony was suffocating. Sarah thought the problem was Margaret's packed schedule. But the schedule was just the symptom. The real problem was deeper, more terrifying. Margaret had forgotten who she was when she wasn't useful. Strip away the committees and the counseling sessions and the constant availability, and what was left? She'd built her entire post-David identity on being needed, because being needed meant she still mattered. Being needed meant God still had a purpose for her. But sitting in her kitchen, staring at a calendar that looked more like a cry for help than a schedule, Margaret felt the question form that she didn't have the courage to answer yet. What if I said no? What if I stopped? Who would I be then? What Margaret didn't know was that someone had been watching. Someone who'd walked this exact road 40 years ago and barely survived it. Ruth had been watching, and Ruth was about to intervene. Wednesday evening, 5:47 p.m. Margaret sat alone in the church office under the hum of fluorescent lights that made everything look vaguely institutional and sad. Her Bible lay open on the desk, the expensive leather-bound one David had given her for their 25th anniversary. now filled with sticky notes and paper-clipped task lists. She'd come here to prepare for tomorrow's women's meeting, to find a scripture passage about perseverance or hope. But as she flipped through the pages, something caught her attention. Every bookmark, every highlighted section, every dog-eared page marked a passage about serving, giving, working, doing. The parable of the talents, the Good Samaritan, Martha and Mary Ann. She'd highlighted Martha's parts, not Mary's. When was the last time she'd turned to the Psalms just to sit? When was the last time she'd read Song of Solomon or lingered in John's Abide in Me passages without immediately turning them into action points? The realization hit like cold water. She knew the church committee meeting schedule better than she knew her last real conversation with God. She could recite the names of 17 women she was mentoring, but couldn't remember the last time she'd prayed something that wasn't a request or an intercession or a desperate "help me get through this." Serving God versus being with God. When had the switch happened? It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a conscious choice. It was a slow drift, so gradual you don't notice until you look up and the shore is gone. She'd traded intimacy for productivity so slowly that she'd convinced herself they were the same thing. Here's the church lie that kills women's faith, the one nobody says out loud. Your service is your relationship with God. Do more, give more, show up more, and you'll feel closer to Him. But it's poison dressed up as piety. Martha wasn't wrong for serving. Jesus didn't rebuke her labor. He rebuked her anxiety, her belief that serving Him was the same as sitting with Him. And Mary wasn't complete either. Both are needed. Both are the rhythm. What Margaret needed was the dance between the two, the sacred pattern that doesn't pit Martha against Mary but weaves them together. Ruth, the 73-year-old church janitor, had tried to tell her last month, "Child, what you need is soul flowing." She pulled out her phone and scrolled to Ruth's contact. Her thumb hovered over the call button. Ruth had been watching her. Margaret knew it now. Ruth had seen the parking lot breakdown, had noticed the hollowness behind Margaret's Sunday smile, had probably recognized the specific exhaustion of a woman who'd confused faithful service with actual faith. Ruth was the one who cleaned the sanctuary at 5 a.m. every morning, who'd told Margaret once, "I used to be like you, running myself ragged for Jesus, while forgetting to sit with Him. Nearly killed me." Then I discovered the difference between grinding for God and flowing with Him. At the time, Margaret had nodded absently, but now those words felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Margaret pressed call. Ruth answered on the first ring, like she'd been waiting. "Took you long enough, child. Come by tomorrow morning, 5 a.m. Don't be late." Margaret hung up, her heart pounding with something that felt dangerously close to hope. But Thursday at 3:47 a.m., her chest pains would return with a vengeance that would send her to the emergency room and into Ruth's wisdom whether she was ready or not. Thursday, 3:47 a.m. Margaret's eyes snapped open to a sensation she knew too well: the elephant sitting on her chest, the invisible fist squeezing her ribcage, the cold sweat breaking out across her forehead and down her spine. Her left arm tingled with pins and needles, exactly the way David had described it 2 years ago when he woke her saying something was wrong. She lay perfectly still in the darkness, listening to her heart slam against her ribs in an arrhythmic panic, and did the terrible mathematics. Chest pressure, left arm numbness, shortness of breath, age 58, family history of cardiac disease, husband dead at 60, from the exact same symptoms. The digital clock on David's side of the bed glowed red. 3:47. Always 3:47. But this time, it wasn't just her soul screaming. This time her body had joined the revolt. She reached for her phone with shaking fingers. 911. 3 numbers. Simple. But what if it was just another panic attack? What if it was nothing again like last month? But what if this was how it ended? She pressed her palm against her chest and felt the wild drumbeat underneath. At 3:52 a.m., she called Ruth instead. Ruth's calm voice answered, "I'm on my way, child. Breathe. I'm calling the ambulance. You're not dying today. God's not done with you yet." 6 hours later, Margaret sat on a paper-covered exam table in the ER. Electrodes still stuck to her chest, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor confirming what the doctor was about to say. Dr. Patel pulled up a stool and met Margaret's eyes with uncomfortable directness. Your heart is structurally sound. No blockages, no damage. But your body is screaming at you, Mrs. Robertson. These are stress-induced cardiac symptoms. And if you don't make radical changes in the next 90 days, we won't be having this conversation. We'll be having a different one. 90 days. The number hung in the air like a countdown timer. I see this in high-functioning women all the time. You're not having heart attacks, you're having breakdown warnings. Your body is trying to stop you before it gives out completely. What you need isn't medication. What you need is biblical rest for women who've forgotten they're human. You're 58. Your husband died of a sudden cardiac event. You're on the same trajectory unless you learn to stop overcoming burnout by pushing through it and start, actually, resting. Ruth sat in the corner of the exam room, silent but solid. When Dr. Patel left, Ruth finally spoke. 90 days, Margaret. That's what you've got. 90 days to choose between grinding yourself into David's grave or learning to flow with the rhythm. God's been trying to teach you. Margaret stared at the heart monitor, watching her pulse spike and settle, the physical manifestation of a life lived in constant fight or flight. I don't know how to stop, she whispered. Everything I do matters. People need me. Ruth stood, walked to the bed, and took Margaret's hand. Child, what people need is a living you, not a martyr. What God needs is you alive enough to hear him. Tonight, when 3:47 a.m. comes, because it will, I want you to try something different. Don't fight it. Don't pray through it. Just surrender to it. That night, discharged with orders to reduce stress, Margaret lay in bed, waiting for 3:47 like a condemned prisoner, waiting for dawn. When her eyes opened at exactly 3:47 a.m., body calm this time, heart steady, she didn't reach for her phone or scroll through anxious thoughts. Instead, Margaret prayed a prayer that sounded like giving up. And in God's economy, sometimes surrender is the only door to salvation. Friday, 3:47 a.m. Margaret's eyes opened not with panic this time, but with a strange, hollow calm. The bedroom was dark except for the sliver of moonlight cutting across the hardwood floor where she'd knelt so many times before. But tonight, she didn't kneel with her spine straight and her words carefully composed. She slid from the bed onto the cold floor and curled into herself, forehead pressed against the wood grain, hands empty at her sides. No eloquent phrases, no scripture quotations, no performance of piety for a God she was too tired to impress anymore. Just Margaret at 58, heart monitor bruises still fresh on her chest. 90-day countdown ticking in her mind, finally running out of everything except the brutal truth. I can't. The words came out broken, barely audible. I don't know how. I'm empty. She pressed her palms flat against the floor. Everyone needs me, and I have nothing left to give. You ask me to love, and I'm hollow. You ask me to serve, and I'm running on fumes. Her voice cracked. I've done everything right. I've served you, raised my kids in the church, loved David well, shown up for everyone. And I'm 58 years old, waking up at 3:47 every morning feeling like you've forgotten I exist. So what do you want from me? Because I can't give any more. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full in a way Margaret couldn't articulate. No audible voice, no supernatural warmth, no verses lighting up in her mind. Just space, room to breathe. The terrifying, liberating discovery that God didn't strike her down for her honesty. In fact, this was the part that made her breath catch. There was something almost like relief in the silence. Like he'd been waiting for her to stop performing and start telling the truth. Surrender isn't weakness, Margaret realized in that moment on the floor. Surrender is the doorway you can only walk through when you finally admit you don't have the strength to keep the door closed anymore. This is what Ruth had meant when she'd said those strange words. Soul flowing starts when the grinding stops. Child, you can't flow with God while you're white-knuckling your way through life. Margaret hadn't understood then. But here, broken open at 3:47 a.m. with nothing left to prove and no energy left to pretend, she understood. The grinding had stopped because her gears had finally seized. And in the stillness, something infinitesimal shifted. She stayed on the floor for 23 minutes, she knew, because when she finally sat up, the clock read for 10. Her knees ached, her back protested, but something in her chest felt different. Not peaceful, she wasn't ready to call it that yet. Not hopeful, hope felt too dangerous to reach for, but different, like a clenched fist slowly, tentatively beginning to open. She pulled herself back into bed and lay on her back, staring at the ceiling. Okay, she whispered to the darkness, to God, to whatever was listening. I don't know what soul flowing means. I don't know how to rest. I don't know who I am without all the doing. But I can't keep grinding, so teach me. It wasn't a triumphant prayer. It was barely a prayer at all, but it was honest. And in God's economy, honest desperation counts as faith. Saturday morning, Margaret woke at 7:15, the latest she'd slept in 2 years, to the sound of knocking at her front door. Ruth stood on the porch holding two things, a thermos of coffee and a leather journal Margaret had never seen before. The journal was David's handwriting. The date on the first page was 2 weeks before he died, and the title made Margaret's knees weak. Soul Flowing. What I wish I'd taught Margaret before it was too late. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened David's journal at Ruth's kitchen table, the leather worn soft from handling she'd never known about. The pages smelled like his cologne, faint now, but unmistakably, and bore the coffee ring stains that marked every book he'd ever loved. Ruth poured 2 mugs and sat across from her, silent, giving Margaret space to absorb what she was seeing. The handwriting was David's careful print, the kind he used when he wanted to remember something important. Dates in the margins showed he'd been writing this for months before his heart gave out. And there, on page 3, highlighted in yellow with asterisks in the margins, was Hebrews 4:9-11, annotated in a way that made Margaret's breath catch. His note in the margin read, God doesn't rest because he's tired. God rests because he's God. There's a difference Margaret needs to understand before it kills her too. She read the passage slowly. There remains therefore a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. Underneath, David had written in red ink, We've got this backwards, Maggie. We think rest is the reward for completing our work. God modeled the opposite. He rested first, on the 7th day. Not because creation exhausted him, but because rest is who he is, not what he earns. Ruth leaned forward, her weathered face gentle. Keep reading, child. Page 7, that's where David put it all together. Margaret flipped ahead and found the page titled, in David's handwriting, The Soul-Flowing Method. What? I'm learning too late. The entry was dated 3 days before his death. I'm watching Margaret grind herself into dust, and I'm doing the same thing. We're both serving God from exhaustion, trying to rest our way back to productivity. But that's not the rhythm Jesus modeled. Jesus withdrew to lonely places before ministry, not after. He rested as the source, not the reward. Mark 1:35. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house and went off to a solitary place. He wasn't recharging batteries. He was flowing from the source. That's what I'm calling soul-flowing rest, as foundation, not as finish line. Service from overflow, not for approval. Margaret looked up at Ruth, understanding dawning like a slow sunrise. This is what you've been trying to tell me. Ruth nodded. David figured it out at the end. I'm praying you figure it out while there's still time. Margaret turned to the next page, where David had created a chart, because of course he had, organized engineer that he was 2 columns, grinding and flowing. Undergrinding. Work hard gives collapse and exhaustion, gives rest guiltily, gives repeat from depletion. Underflowing. Rest in God gives serve from overflow, gives return to rest, gives repeat from fullness. At the bottom of the page, David had written in capital letters, Maggie, rest isn't what you do after, you've earned it. Rest is where you start. This is what mature women of faith need to learn. Biblical rest for women isn't optional, it's oxygen. Stop performing Sabbath and start receiving it. The morning routine with God isn't about productivity, it's about presence. Flow with him. Stop grinding against him. Ruth's voice was soft. That's what I practice every morning at 5 a.m., Margaret. Not a quiet time to check off my list. A soul-flowing rhythm where I remember who I am, God's daughter, not his employee. Want to learn? Margaret closed the journal and pressed it against her chest, feeling the weight of David's final gift. She looked at Ruth through tears. Teach me, please. I don't want to die the way he did, realizing the truth too late. Ruth smiled. Tomorrow morning, 5 a.m. Bring that journal. You're about to discover why Jesus called it the easy yoke. The grinding has been killing you. The flowing is about to save your life. Sunday morning, 9:15 a.m. Margaret sat in the church sanctuary's third row, her usual spot, but this time she'd brought David's journal and a yellow highlighter instead of her phone and mental to-do list. Pastor Tom was preaching from Mark 6, something about the feeding of the 5,000. But Margaret had stopped listening 3 verses earlier when he'd glossed over Mark 6:31 like it was transition text instead of revolution. She flipped back in her own Bible and read the verse again. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." The people were hungry. The needs were urgent. The crowds were pressing in. And Jesus' response wasn't work harder or push through or their needs matter more than yours. His response was, come away, rest. Now, her highlighter hovered over the page as the pattern she'd never noticed before suddenly blazed into focus. She flipped backward through the Gospels, Mark 1:35, very early in the morning. While it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house and went off to a solitary place. Luke 5:16, but Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Matthew 14:23, after he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Every single time Jesus left, he withdrew. He said no to crowds, literally, walked away from people who needed him so he could say yes to the Father. She scribbled in the journal margin, her handwriting shaky. Jesus modeled soul flowing. Retreat to God, return for people. Never from people directly to people without the source in between. This was the missing piece. She'd been grinding herself to death, trying to compensate for Jesus. Didn't serve from exhaustion and then rest guiltily afterward. He rested first early, consistently, even when it looked irresponsibly, and served from that overflow. The Gethsemane prayer wasn't a one-time crisis moment. It was the culmination of a lifetime pattern of withdrawing to flow with the Father. Every miracle, every sermon, every moment of compassion came from those early morning lonely places, not despite them. Margaret thought about her own morning routine with God, or what used to pass for one. Open Bible, scan a devotional, pray through the prayer list, check it off, move to the next task. Productivity, masquerading as intimacy. Performance instead of presence. No wonder she felt empty. She'd been trying to give from a well she never stopped to let refill. After the service, Margaret sat in her car and Googled something Ruth had mentioned yesterday. MIT's Spiritual Clarity Research Women 57. The study popped up immediately, and the abstract made her hands still. Recent neuroscience research indicates that women's capacity for spiritual and emotional integration peaks between ages 55 to 60. Suggesting this developmental stage offers unique opportunities for deepened faith practices and finding purpose after 50. David had written in the journal that God was inviting her, not punishing her. The 3:47 a.m. wake-ups weren't a curse, they were an invitation to the exact rhythm Jesus modeled. Margaret's soul was keeping better time than her exhausted mind. Her body's rebellion at 58 wasn't breakdown. It was breakthrough trying to happen. She opened her calendar app and did something that would have been unthinkable a week ago. She blocked 5 a.m. to 6 a.m. every single day for the next 90 days. No meetings, no exceptions. Just the label, soul flowing with God. Her finger hesitated over the save button, the voice of wasted years, already whispering about selfishness, about neglecting responsibilities. But then she remembered Jesus literally leaving crowds of hungry people to pray. And she pressed save. Monday, 3:47 a.m. Margaret's eyes would open, but this time, she wouldn't fight it. This time, she'd flow with it. Monday, 5 a.m. For the first time in 48 mornings, Margaret's eyes opened past 3:47 without her heart slamming into panic mode. The alarm she'd set for 4:55 hadn't even gone off yet. Her body had simply known. She sat up slowly, testing this strange new calm like someone checking if thin ice would hold. She made tea chamomile, not coffee, and carried the steaming mug to the living room where she'd moved David's reading chair to face the east window. No Bible study guide waiting. No prayer list typed on her phone. No sermon notes to review. Just Margaret, the chair, the window framing darkness that would soon yield to light, and the terrifying freedom of an hour with no agenda except presence. She sat, just sat, sipped tea, watched the window, opened her Bible to no particular place. It fell open to Psalms, and she let it stay there. The voice of wasted years erupted immediately. You're wasting time. There are 17 women counting on you. 3 committee meetings to prep for Sarah's marriage falling apart, and you're sitting here doing nothing. Her fingers twitched toward her phone, toward productivity, toward the familiar grinding rhythm. But Ruth's words echoed stronger. Soul flowing isn't about doing nothing. It's about being with before you do. So Margaret sat and waited, and felt the crushing guilt of a woman who'd confused busyness with godliness for 58 years. Then so subtle, she almost missed it: warmth. Not supernatural fire or mystical experience, just presence. The same feeling she used to get early in her marriage when David would wake before her and she'd roll over to find him watching her sleep. His love so tangible she could feel it before opening her eyes. When did I stop recognizing you as lover and start treating you only as boss? The thought came unbidden, and with it, a grief so profound, she had to set the tea down. Somewhere between saying I do to Jesus at 17 and burying David at 56, she'd traded intimacy for duty. She'd become God's employee, not his beloved. Every prayer had become a report, every worship song a performance review. Every Bible reading a study session instead of a love letter. She'd been serving God though, she'd been serving him with everything she had, but she hadn't just been with him, no agenda, no outcome required, in years. This is what finding purpose after 50 actually meant, not discovering a new job description for God, but rediscovering her original identity as his daughter, his beloved, the one he calls by name in the early morning hours. The sky began to lighten deep, purple giving way to pink, and Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. Like a fist that had been clenched for 2 years, finally releasing. She wasn't praying words. She was just present, breathing, letting herself be loved before she tried to prove she deserved it. This was soul flowing, the transformation from grinding service to flowing relationship, from faith-based productivity rooted in fear to rest rooted in belovedness. 23 minutes of silence. No lightning bolts. No audible voice. Just the slow, steady return of peace that didn't require her to earn it first. She was reaching for her journal to write this down when her phone shattered the silence. Sarah, calling at 5:23 a.m. East Coast time, which meant 2:23 a.m. in Seattle. Margaret's hand hovered over the phone, and the old panic started. Answer, fix, solve. She answered. Sarah's voice came through broken. Mom, James left. He's gone. I don't know what to do. And in that moment, Margaret understood the deepest truth about soul flowing. It wasn't escape from the world's pain. It was the oxygen mask you put on first so you could actually help others breathe. Margaret had just spent 23 minutes being filled. Now she could pour out without emptying herself completely. The battles ahead would be real. But for the first time in 2 years, she'd face them equipped instead of already depleted. Tuesday, 5 a.m. Margaret's planner sat in her bag across the room, the expensive leather one Sarah had given her last Christmas. Its pages color-coded and tabbed, with the precision of someone trying to control the uncontrollable. She could see it from David's chair, practically glowing in the pre-dawn darkness, like some kind of productivity beacon calling her back to the familiar grinding rhythm. Her hands felt empty without it. Naked, wrong. For 37 years, her first waking action had been to review the day's obligations, to mentally prepare for the gauntlet of other people's needs. But this morning, day 2 of her soul Flowing experiment. Margaret kept her hands wrapped around her tea mug and left the planner untouched. The discomfort was physical. The guilt was immediate. The voice of wasted years was apoplectic. Your phone is buzzing. Janet needs an answer. The committee meeting is today. You haven't prepared. What kind of leader shows up unprepared? She opened David's journal instead, finding the page where he'd drawn 2 timelines in blue ink. The first, the light productive quiet time Bible study, plus prayer list, plus devotional. Then serving equals spiritual maturity. The second, the truth being with him, no agenda. Just presence, then serving from that overflow equals soul flowing. Margaret read it 3 times. Her engineer husband's logic cutting through decades of messaging that had taught her to measure her morning routine with God by how much she accomplished in it. Here's the lie nobody tells you about spiritual growth after 50. Positive thinking is spiritual bypass. All those memes about choosing joy and thinking positive thoughts and speaking blessings over your day, they're just grinding with a smile. They're performing happiness to avoid the hard work of actually healing. Margaret set down the journal and did something that felt dangerously rebellious. She sat with her own darkness instead of trying to pray it away. The 3:47 a.m. wake-ups weren't happening because she needed to think more positively. The chest pains weren't appearing because she wasn't grateful enough. The soul exhaustion wasn't the result of insufficient Bible study. These were symptoms of a deeper sickness, the sickness of a woman who'd spent decades overcoming burnout, Christian style, by simply adding more spiritual practices to an already crushing load. Stop praying for happiness, she realized. God wasn't using her Sunday smile for kingdom work. God was using her 3 a.m. darkness, her honest desperation, her complete breakdown more than any of her carefully curated testimonies ever had. This is what Ruth meant about biblical rest for women. It's not pretty. It's not Instagram worthy. It doesn't start with 7 steps to a better quiet time. It starts with sitting in your own soul-deep exhaustion and letting God meet you there. 10 minutes of sitting became 20. The guilt slowly dissolved, not because Margaret conquered it with positive affirmations, but because she stopped fighting it and let it exist alongside God's presence. Both could be true. She could feel guilty about the unopened planner and be exactly where God wanted her. She could feel irresponsible for not checking her phone and be practicing the most responsible thing she'd done in years, choosing relationship before productivity. This was soul flowing, the messy, uncomfortable, gloriously imperfect practice of letting your spiritual life stop being about performance and start being about presence. At 5:47, she finally opened the planner, looked at the day, and here's what shocked her. None of it was urgent. None of it would collapse without her. The committee could meet without her notes. Janet could wait 2 hours for a text. The world would not end if Margaret spent 60 minutes being a daughter before she spent 8 hours being everyone's savior. By day 7 of this rhythm, 7 consecutive mornings of soul flowing before grinding, something was different. Margaret felt it in her body first. Lighter, steadier. The 3:47 a.m. wake-ups had shifted to 4:30, then to 5 o'clock naturally. But Sarah noticed it from 3,000 miles away, in a way that made Margaret's hands shake when she read the text. Mom, I don't know what you're doing differently, but you sound like yourself again. Like the mom from before Dad died. What changed? Wednesday afternoon, Ruth's kitchen smelled like cinnamon and decades of answered prayers. Margaret sat at the worn oak table, the same one where Ruth had served communion to shut-ins, counseled battered wives, and probably saved more souls than the pastor ever had from his pulpit. Ruth pulled a paper napkin from the dispenser and uncapped a blue ballpoint pen, her movements deliberate as a surgeon's. You're doing the practice, Ruth said, not looking up, but you don't fully understand the philosophy yet. And if you don't understand why soul flowing works, you'll abandon it the first time someone makes you feel guilty for it. She drew a vertical line down the center of the napkin, creating 2 columns. At the top of the left column, she wrote grinding. At the top of the right, flowing. Then she looked up at Margaret with eyes that had seen this exact teaching moment play out 100 times before. Everything you think you know about rest is backwards. Child, let me show you. Ruth drew a jagged line in the grinding column, sharp peaks and valleys like a heart monitor in crisis. This is what you've been doing your whole life. Work until you collapse. Rest guiltily until you feel strong enough to work again. Repeat from depletion. See, you start each cycle already empty, trying to earn the right to rest by working yourself into the ground first. Then you rest, but the whole time you're resting, you feel like you're wasting time, being selfish. So you cut rest short and jump back into work before you're actually refilled. Ruth's pen moved in a smooth upward spiral in the flowing column. Soul flowing starts with rest, not as reward, as foundation. You rest first. You serve from that overflow. Then you return to rest before depletion hits. See the difference? You never go below baseline. You're always starting full. You don't rest from your calling, Margaret. You rest into your calling. That's what Jesus modeled. That's what the Sabbath was always meant to be, not a finish line you earn, but a starting line you launch from. Margaret's hand moved to her chest, feeling her heartbeat steady and strong in a way it hadn't been since the ER visit. This is what David was trying to tell me in the journal. This is what you practice every morning at 5 a.m. Ruth nodded. This is biblical rest for women who've been taught that rest is what you do after you've proven your worth. Child, that's not rest, that's collapse. Real rest, soul-flowing rest, is the source you drink from, not the reward you earn. Ruth pushed the napkin across the table. Joyce Meyer said something years ago that I'll never forget. You can't give from an empty well. And guilt doesn't fill wells. Margaret picked up the napkin, studying the two patterns like they were sacred text. The grinding pattern looked like her entire calendar, her entire approach to faith-based productivity. Her entire 58 years of believing that if she just worked hard enough, eventually she'd earn the right to rest without guilt. But she never had. The guilt always won. But what about Margaret? Started, and Ruth held up a hand. What about Paul's press on toward the goal? What about work out your salvation? What about all the verses that talk about diligence and labor? Read them again in context. Child, every single one assumes you're flowing from God's strength, not grinding to earn it. Big difference. Ruth stood and poured them both fresh coffee. Tomorrow morning at your 5 a.m. prayer routine, I want you to try something. Say no to one thing on your calendar. Just one. Pick something you've been doing out of obligation, guilt, or the belief that you're indispensable. And when the voice of wasted years screams that you're being selfish, I want you to look at this napkin and remember, you're not abandoning your calling. You're creating margin so God can actually flow through you. She handed Margaret the napkin. Keep this. Frame it if you have to. Because what I'm about to teach you next is going to blow your theology wide open. God wasn't asking for more from you, Margaret. He's been offering you less. And you've been too busy grinding to notice. Thursday, 5 a.m. Margaret sat in David's chair with her Bible open to Matthew 11. Verses 28 to 30 staring up at her in black and red letters she'd read approximately 1,000 times in her life. She'd memorized them at vacation Bible school when she was 9. She'd embroidered them on a pillow for her mother. She'd quoted them to grieving widows and exhausted young mothers. But this morning, day 14 of her soul-flowing practice, Margaret read those verses and saw them for the first time. Actually saw them. She picked up her yellow highlighter with shaking hands. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Margaret's finger traced the words, and something cracked open in her chest. She'd been coming to Jesus her entire life, but she'd been coming with her load, not to him for an exchange. Every prayer had been her dragging her crushing burdens into his presence, and then keeping them, holding them tighter, adding his expectations to her existing weight until she was carrying her responsibilities plus what she thought he required, plus the guilt of never doing either well enough. She'd read "Take my yoke" as "Add my yoke to yours." She'd read "My burden is light," as "You should be able to handle this easily. So what's wrong with you that you can't?" Margaret stood up from the chair, her whole body trembling, because the implications were seismic. For 58 years, she'd believed that spiritual maturity meant carrying more responsibility, more ministry, more service, more sacrifice. That finding purpose after 50 meant doubling down, working harder to prove she still mattered now that her children were grown and her husband was gone. But Jesus was saying the exact opposite. His yoke is easy. His burden is light. Not because he's asking less of her, he's offering to carry what she was never supposed to carry in the first place. This is soul flowing, the exchange at the heart of biblical rest for women. She gives him her crushing weight, the expectations, the performance, the grinding need to earn her value on. He gives her his easy yoke, which is simply to abide in his love and serve from that place instead of for that place. The yoke isn't more to carry. It's the trade. Her heavy for his light, her grinding for his flowing, her exhaustion for his rest. And she'd spent decades refusing the exchange because she thought rest was something she had to earn first. Margaret grabbed David's journal and flipped to a blank page, her handwriting messy with urgency. The yoke equals the exchange I've been refusing. I've been trying to carry my burden plus his yoke. But he's saying, give me yours. Take mine instead. Mine is light. This is soul flowing, the constant returning to the exchange. Underneath she wrote, neuroscience proves 5 a.m. prayer rewires the amygdala in 21 days. Margaret was on day 14, exactly 2 weeks into her morning routine with God, 2 weeks of choosing presence over productivity, being overdoing, soul flowing over grinding, and something in her brain was literally, physically changing. The anxiety pathways were being replaced with peace pathways. Science was confirming what Scripture had been saying all along. Rest isn't reward. Rest is rewiring. She looked at her phone, at the 17 unread messages and 4 missed calls from people who needed her, expected her, had built entire support systems around her constant availability. And for the first time in her adult life, she understood. Saying yes to everyone else's emergencies while saying no to her own soul wasn't faithfulness. It was slow suicide dressed up as ministry. Friday morning, she would practice her first sacred no, not because she didn't care, but because she finally understood that she couldn't give what she didn't have. The yoke exchange required boundary setting. Soul flowing demanded margin making. And God was about to teach her that sometimes the most spiritual thing a woman can do is close a door everyone else thinks should stay open. Friday, 2:17 p.m. Margaret's phone vibrated on the kitchen counter, the 4th call in 30 minutes from Pastor Tom. Each voicemail progressively more urgent. She stood 3 feet away from it, staring at the screen like it was a live grenade, her hand literally shaking as she reached for it. Not to answer, to decline. The church's annual grief seminar was in 6 weeks, and Pastor Tom Needano expected Margaret to lead it. She'd led it for the past 3 years. She was the obvious choice. The widow who'd survived. The mentor who'd counseled dozens of women through loss. The mature woman of faith who always said yes. Her thumb hovered over the red decline button, and every cell in her body screamed that this was wrong, selfish. A betrayal of everything she'd built her post-David identity on. But Ruth's napkin diagram was taped to her refrigerator. The yoke exchange was written in her journal. And Margaret had 7 days left of her 21-day amygdala rewiring window. This was the test. She pressed decline. The call dropped. Silence flooded the kitchen. Margaret's heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. The voice of wasted years roared, "You're letting everyone down. The grief seminar needs you. This is your purpose. Without this, what are you?" Her fingers flew to her phone, ready to call back, apologize, say yes like she always did. But then she remembered, the yoke is light. If this feels crushing, it's not his yoke, it's the one she was supposed to trade. Margaret opened her text messages with trembling fingers and typed, "Pastor Tom, I can't lead the grief seminar this year. I need this season to focus on my own healing and soul-flowing rhythm with God. I can recommend 3 other women who would do beautifully." Her thumb hovered over send for a full minute. This was a complete sentence with a period, not an apology. "No, I'm so sorry," or "I feel terrible," or "if you can't find anyone else, call me." Just a clear, clean boundary from a woman who was learning that biblical rest for women requires margin, and margin requires the sacred no. She pressed send before she could change her mind. The whooshing sound felt like jumping off a cliff. And then, nothing. No lightning, no divine rebook, no immediate catastrophic collapse of her reputation, or her ministry, or her worth to God. Just silence, just space. Just the slow, terrifying, liberating truth that she'd just practiced soul flowing in real time. Rest as foundation, not reward. Boundary as worship, not selfishness. 1 hour later, her phone buzzed. Not Pastor Tom, Sarah, a text mom. I just got off the phone with Pastor Tom. He mentioned you're taking a step back from some things. Are you okay? You sound different, lighter. Margaret stared at those last 2 words. You sound different, lighter. And something broke open inside her chest that felt dangerously close to joy. Different, lighter, not broken, not selfish, not backslidden, or spiritually weak or abandoning her calling. Different and lighter. Like someone who'd been carrying concrete blocks disguised as a yoke and had finally, mercifully, set them down. She texted back, I'm learning to flow instead of grind. Even with God. Especially with God. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, I want to learn that too, Mom. James leaving broke something open in me. Can we talk tomorrow morning? Like, actually talk? Not you counseling me, but both of us just being honest. Margaret's eyes filled. This was it. This was the fruit of soul-flowing transformation. The overflow that comes when you stop grinding yourself empty and start serving from fullness. She texted Sarah back, 5 a.m. my time, 8 a.m. yours. I'll have coffee. You have space. We'll have honesty. But Saturday night, everything Margaret had been carefully building would come crashing down in a way she never saw coming. Because the voice of wasted years doesn't give up easily. Saturday night, Margaret's phone would ring. And the crisis on the other end would test whether soul flowing was real theology or just another self-help mirage. Saturday morning, 8:47 a.m. Margaret sat at Ruth's kitchen table, watching the 73-year-old woman try to flip a pancake and completely miss the pan, sending it sliding across the counter like a frisbee. Ruth stared at the pancake disaster for 2 full seconds, then looked at Margaret with such perfect comedic timing that Margaret felt it the thing she thought had died with David, the thing she'd forgotten her body knew how to do. A laugh, not the polite chuckle she performed at church, not the encouraging sound she made when counseling broken women. A real, from the belly, head thrown back laugh that erupted from somewhere so deep inside her she'd forgotten it existed. Ruth grinned and flipped another pancake deliberately onto the floor. There, she said. That's the sound I've been waiting to hear for 2 years. Margaret laughed until tears ran down her face, and she couldn't tell if they were from joy or grief or the terrifying relief of feeling anything spontaneous at all. The laughter faded slowly, leaving Margaret breathless and slightly dizzy, like someone who'd just surfaced after being underwater too long. Joy. That's what this was. Not happiness. Happiness was circumstantial, fleeting. This was joy, returning in fragments like pieces of a shattered vase, slowly reassembling themselves. Not in explosion, but in small moments she almost missed because she'd stopped looking for them. Yesterday, she'd caught herself humming while making tea. Wednesday, she'd smiled at a cardinal in the backyard. This morning, she'd woken naturally at 5 a.m. without the crushing dread that had made every sunrise feel like facing a firing squad. Ruth poured fresh coffee and sat across from her, leaving the pancake casualties on the floor. You know what you've been doing wrong all these years? Ruth asked, not unkindly. You've been so busy being strong for everyone else, you forgot you had permission to be light, to be silly, to laugh at stupid jokes and burnt pancakes. You built your whole identity after David on being the rock, the wise mentor, the unshakable mature woman of faith. But child, God didn't design you to be unshakable. He designed you to be human. Jesus wept. He got frustrated. He probably laughed until his sides hurt. Strength isn't the absence of lightness. It's having the courage to be fully alive, fully feeling, fully present to joy when it shows up, even when your circumstances haven't earned it yet. Margaret wrapped both hands around her coffee mug, feeling the warmth seep into her palms. She'd been so afraid that if she stopped being strong, she'd completely fall apart. But the opposite was happening. The more she allowed herself to be human, tired, honest, even joyful in small moments, the more integrated she felt. Soul flowing wasn't about becoming some enlightened spiritual being who transcended human emotion. It was about becoming fully, messily, gloriously human again. That afternoon, Margaret did something she hadn't done in 2 years. She bought flowers. Not for anyone's funeral or hospital room. Just for herself. Yellow tulips from the grocery store. Ridiculously cheerful and completely impractical. She put them in the vase on her kitchen table and stared at them like they were alien objects. When was the last time she'd done something purely for the joy of it, with no productivity attached, no ministry outcome required? That evening she played music, not worship music, but the old jazz standards David used to love. She danced in her kitchen, in her socks, badly, alone, and felt something that had been frozen for 24 months start to thaw. This wasn't denial of her grief. This wasn't toxic positivity or spiritual bypass. This was the fruit of soul flowing. Permission to be alive while still healing. To hold sorrow in one hand and joy in the other without requiring them to cancel each other out. But Sunday at church 20-4 hours after the pancake laughter, 18 hours after the kitchen dancing, the voice of wasted years struck back with surgical precision. Margaret walked into the sanctuary feeling lighter than she had in months, and saw 3 women she'd been mentoring sitting in her usual pew. Janet, Rebecca, Patricia. All 3 looked up at her with eyes that said what their mouths didn't. Where have you been? We've needed you. And just like that, the joy that had felt so fragile and new began to crack under the weight of expectation, obligation, and the crushing question, who was she if she wasn't everyone's answer? Sunday, 4:17 p.m. Margaret sat on her living room floor, surrounded by torn pieces of paper, her hands shaking as she tried to tape for scripture passages together into something that wouldn't disintegrate the next time the voice of wasted years attacked. Church had been brutal. Not because of anything dramatic, no confrontation, no public shaming, but because of the looks. Janet's disappointed eyes when Margaret said she couldn't meet for coffee this week. Rebecca's hurt silence when Margaret explained she wasn't taking on new counseling commitments right now. Patricia's barely concealed judgment. We all have hard seasons, Margaret. That's when we lean in, not pull back. By the time she'd escaped to her car, the 2 weeks of soul flowing felt like they were built on sand, already washing away under the tide of everyone else's expectations. But Ruth had texted her during the drive home. Go to the 4 passages. Paperclip them together. These are your anchor. So here she sat, Bible open, hands trembling, looking for solid ground. Psalm 23, Matthew 11, Hebrews 4, Mark 6. Ruth had written the references on the back of the napkin diagram, and now Margaret spread them across the floor like a roadmap back to sanity. She started with Psalm 23, verse 2. He makes me lie down in green pastures. Makes, not suggests. Not invites, makes. She'd read this verse at 100 funerals, always focusing on the comfort of green pastures and still waters. But the verb choice makes that was new. God physically, forcibly making her lie down because she'd lost the ability to rest voluntarily. Her chest pains, her 3:47 a.m. wake-ups, her body's rebellion, those weren't punishments. They were God making her lie down before she worked herself to death like David. Permission wasn't just granted, it was commanded. She moved to Mark 6:31. Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. Jesus said this to his disciples after they'd been serving crowds, healing the sick, casting out demons, doing actual kingdom work. And his response to their exhaustion wasn't push through. His response was, come away, rest. Now, not after you've finished everything. Not when you've earned it. Now, while people still need you, while the work is still urgent, while others might judge you for stepping back. Margaret grabbed her highlighter and marked the context. Because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat. This was biblical rest for women in the middle of crisis, not after. This was soul flowing in real time, Jesus prioritizing his disciples' souls over the crowd's needs. She paper-clipped the 4 passages together and wrote on an index card, "My anchor when the voice attacks." Psalm 23, permission as command. Matthew 11, the yoke exchange. Hebrews 4, rest as God's nature, not reward. Mark 6, come away now, not later. These weren't just nice verses to embroider on pillows. These were her lifeline, the scriptural foundation for everything Ruth was teaching her about soul flowing. She taped the index card to her bathroom mirror, right next to the clock where she saw it every morning at 5 a.m. Because here's what she was learning. Biblical rest wasn't a one-time decision you make and then you're fixed. It was a daily, hourly, minute-by-minute choice to believe what God said about rest over what everyone else said about productivity. Every time someone made her feel guilty for boundaries, she'd come back to these 4 passages. Every time the voice whispered she was selfish, she'd read Jesus literally leaving hungry crowds to pray. Every time she doubted whether soul flowing was really biblical or just self-help dressed up in Christian language, she'd remember, "He makes me lie down, because left to myself, I'll grind until I die." Margaret fell asleep that night at 9:30 p.m., expecting to wake at 5 a.m. like she had for the past 2 weeks. But Monday at 3:47 a.m., her eyes snapped open to crushing darkness, her heart slamming into panic mode, her chest tight with the old familiar terror. The darkness had returned, and it had brought friends. Tuesday morning, 6:47 a.m. Margaret stood in the church kitchen setting up coffee for the women's ministry volunteers, her hands moving through the familiar ritual of measuring grounds, filling carafes, arranging cream and sugar on the serving table. She'd done this exact task hundreds of times over the past 3 years, arriving early, always making sure everything was perfect, always taking on the background work nobody else wanted. But this morning felt different. Not the task was identical. Not the people Janet and Rebecca were already arriving, chatting about their weekend. The difference was inside Margaret's chest, in the quality of her breath, in the absence of resentment that used to coat every coffee scoop like bitter residue. She was serving from rest, not grinding toward it. Same action, completely different source. And her body knew the difference even if her mind was still catching up. Janet approached the coffee station, her smile tight. "Margaret, I'm so glad you're here. I was worried after you canceled coffee last week that you were stepping back from everything." The unspoken accusation hung in the air. Abandoning us, becoming unreliable, choosing yourself over the ministry. 2 weeks ago, that tone would have sent Margaret into frantic reassurance mode. But this morning, after 21 days of 5 a.m. soul flowing, after the yoke exchange, after the scripture anchors, Margaret poured coffee and spoke a truth that felt both terrifying and liberating. "I'm not stepping back. I'm learning to serve from overflow instead of for worthiness. There's a difference." Margaret wiped down the counter, feeling the theology crystallize in real time. Here's the Martha vindication nobody preaches. Martha wasn't wrong for serving. Jesus didn't rebuke her labor. He loved her enough to eat the meals she prepared. He rebuked her anxiety, her resentment, her belief that serving him was the same as sitting with him, her judgment of Mary for choosing differently. And Mary wasn't complete either. You can't stay at Jesus's feet forever when there's a world that needs feeding. Both women were right. Both were incomplete, alone. What was needed, what Margaret was finally learning through soul flowing, was the dance between the two. The rhythm. Mary first, then Martha. Being with God, then serving for people. Receive, then give. Flow. Don't grind. This is what true spiritual productivity looks like for mature women of faith, not choosing one over the other, but understanding that timing is everything. Rest is the source. Service is the overflow. Get the order right, and both become worship instead of warfare. Margaret served coffee for 2 hours, the same 2 hours she would have served before her soul-flowing awakening. She smiled at the same women, refilled the same carafes, cleaned the same spills. Externally, nothing had changed, but internally, she went home at 9:30 a.m. feeling peaceful instead of depleted, energized instead of resentful, clear instead of clouded. This was the fruit of soul flowing in motion. She'd started her day at 5 a.m. with God, filled from that well, and now at 9:30 she was still, full, not empty, not needing 3 hours to recover from 2 hours of service. She'd served from overflow, and overflow was still there when she finished. This is what Ruth meant by the spiral, instead of the jagged line. This is what biblical rest for women actually produces. Capacity that doesn't collapse the moment it's tested. Margaret was pulling into her driveway, mentally planning her afternoon, maybe a walk, maybe lunch with a friend, when her phone rang. Ruth. But Ruth's voice wasn't the calm, knowing tone Margaret had come to depend on. Ruth's voice was shaking. "Margaret, I need you to come over, right now. There's something I haven't told you about soul flowing, about why I taught it to you, about what happened to me 40 years ago." A pause, heavy with something that sounded like shame. "I almost died from what you're going through. And I'm not sure I should have taught you this method without telling you the whole truth first." Wednesday evening, 6:15 p.m. Margaret sat at Ruth's dining room table, staring at three strangers, who felt like looking into mirrors, reflecting different versions of her own breaking. Ruth had called them together. Margaret didn't know why yet, didn't understand the urgency in Ruth's voice yesterday. But here they sat. Jennifer, maybe mid-50s, hands clasped so tight her knuckles were white. Patricia, older, 60s probably, with the hollowed-out eyes of someone running on fumes. Linda, close to Margaret's age, wearing a church volunteer badge still pinned to her cardigan like armor she'd forgotten to remove. The table was set with Ruth's good china, the kind you use for serious conversations, for confessions, for the moments when regular coffee mugs feel too casual for the weight of what needs to be said. Ruth poured tea with shaking hands, and Margaret noticed for the first time how old she looked, how tired, how much this cost her. "I told you I learned soul flowing 40 years ago," Ruth began, not looking at any of them, focusing on the teapot. "What I didn't tell you is that I learned it in a hospital bed after my third suicide attempt." The air left the room. Margaret's hand froze halfway to her teacup. Ruth continued, her voice steady but strained. "I was 33, 5 kids under 10, pastor's wife, women's ministry leader, the church's answer to every crisis. And I woke up every single morning at 3:47 a.m. with crushing chest pains and the absolute certainty that God had forgotten I existed. I was you. I was grinding myself to death for Jesus, while forgetting to sit with him. And I almost didn't survive learning the difference." Jennifer made a small sound, half gasp, half sob. Patricia's hands covered her mouth. Linda whispered, "I wake at 3:47 too. Every morning for 8 months." Margaret felt the room tilt. "So do I," Jennifer said. 6 months. "Since my husband died." Patricia nodded. 2 years. "Since my youngest moved out and I realized I had no idea who I was without mothering." Ruth pulled out a folder and spread photocopied research articles across the table. 85%, she said, tapping one of the pages. 85% of Christian women over 50 report feeling spiritually invisible, emotionally exhausted, and uncertain of their purpose. This isn't just us. This isn't personal failure. This is an epidemic nobody talks about because we're supposed to be the wise ones, the mentors, the women who have it all figured out by now. But we're dying, quietly, politely. We're serving ourselves into graves while everyone applauds our faithfulness. We're the invisible 85% mature women of faith who love God desperately and feel absolutely nothing when we pray, who wake at 3:47 a.m. with our souls screaming truths our mouths are too afraid to say, who've confused grinding for God with flowing with Him. Margaret stared at these 3 women strangers. 30 minutes ago, sisters no one saw her own secret shame reflected back. They weren't broken, they were normal. "I've been practicing soul flowing for 3 weeks, Margaret heard herself say, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "Ruth taught me the yoke exchanged the difference between serving from rest versus grinding to earn rest. The scriptures that gave me permission to be human instead of superhuman. The 5 a.m. rhythm that's rewiring my brain. I'm not healed. I still wake at 3:47 sometimes. I still feel guilty when I set boundaries. But I'm learning that soul flowing isn't about becoming some perfect spiritual being. It's about becoming fully, messily alive again. It's about remembering you're God's daughter, not his employee. Jennifer started crying, not polite tears, but deep, shaking sobs. I thought I was the only one. I thought something was wrong with me. Patricia reached across the table and gripped her hand. We're all dying the same death. Maybe we can learn to live the same life too. Ruth pulled out for more copies of David's journal pages, the napkin diagram, the scripture anchors. That's why I called you here. To start what I should have started 40 years ago. A community of women choosing soul flowing over grinding, truth over performance, life over slow death. They sat around Ruth's table until 9:30 p.m. for broken women and one survivor, sharing stories of 3:47 a.m. terrors and church parking lot breakdowns and the crushing loneliness of being everyone's rock while drowning inside. They didn't have answers yet. They didn't have a plan, but they had each other. They had Ruth's wisdom. They had the soul-flowing method. And they had a name, whispered by Linda as they were leaving. The 5 a.m. Sisters. But Thursday morning at 6:47 a.m., Margaret's phone would ring with news that would validate everything she'd learned. Dr. Patel's voice would be cautious, measured. Mrs. Robertson, your 30-day follow-up shows remarkable improvement. Whatever you've been doing, it's saving your life. Friday afternoon, 2:47 p.m. Margaret was kneeling in her backyard, pulling weeds from the flower bed. David had planted something she hadn't had energy for in 2 years when she heard the car door slam in her driveway. She looked up, dirt under her fingernails, hair probably a mess, wearing David's old gardening shirt, and froze. Sarah, standing 20 feet away next to a rental car Margaret hadn't heard pull up, her daughter's face doing something complicated between shock and wonder. Sarah just stared, her purse sliding off her shoulder onto the gravel, her mouth slightly open, not moving, not speaking, just staring at her mother like she was seeing a ghost. Or maybe like she was seeing her mother for the first time in 2 years. Margaret stood slowly, brushing dirt from her knees, suddenly self-conscious. Sarah, I didn't know you were Mom. Sarah interrupted, her voice strange, tight. Mom, you're glowing. The word hung between them like something physical. She wasn't glowing. She was dirty, sweaty, wearing a dead man's shirt while pulling weeds on a Friday afternoon. But Sarah walked closer, her eyes scanning Margaret's face like she was looking for the trick. Your face, it's different, not the smile, the actual light in your eyes. And you're in the garden. You haven't touched this garden since Dad died. They sat on the back porch steps, shoulder to shoulder, watching the sun paint the sky pink and orange. Sarah had flown in unannounced because she'd been worried that her mother saying no to the grief seminar meant she was giving up, shutting down, spiraling. But what she'd found instead was this, a woman pulling weeds, a woman with dirt under her nails and peace in her eyes, a woman who looked lighter, steadier, more present than she had since David's funeral. It's not a program, Margaret said finally. Soul flowing isn't a 10-step plan or a church ministry. It's learning to flow with God's rhythm instead of grinding against it. It's choosing to be his daughter before I'm everyone's savior. It's finding purpose after 50 by rediscovering I had worth before I ever did anything to earn it. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then, can you teach me? Because Mom, I've been grinding too. The marriage ended because I was performing strength instead of admitting I needed help. I wake up exhausted. I feel nothing when I pray. I'm 32 and I feel like I'm already burning out. Margaret's breath caught. Her daughter, her capable, successful, put-together daughter, was drowning in the same waters Margaret had nearly drowned in. Tomorrow morning, Margaret said, 5 a.m. my time. I'll call you, and we'll practice soul flowing together. She pulled out her phone and showed Sarah the scripture anchors. The napkin diagram Ruth had drawn, David's journal entries about the yoke exchange. Sarah read them with the intensity of someone grasping for a lifeline, and Margaret saw herself 4 weeks ago desperate, empty, running out of everything except the brutal honesty that surrender required. The 5 a.m. Sisters, Margaret explained. It started with just me and Ruth. Now there are 4 of us 5, I guess. If you join, women who were secretly dying while everyone applauded our faithfulness. We meet virtually twice a week for morning routine with God. No performance. No pretending. Just honest women learning biblical rest for women who forgot we're human. Sarah's eyes filled. I need this, Mom. I need you to teach me before I end up where you were 4 weeks ago. And Margaret understood. This was the real fruit of soul-flowing transformation. Not her own healing, that was just the beginning. The real fruit was having something to give from overflow instead of depletion. They talked until sunset, until Sarah's tears dried and Margaret's story was told. When Sarah left for her hotel, she hugged Margaret harder than she had since she was a little girl. I got my mom back, she whispered. I didn't even know I'd lost her until I saw her again. But Saturday at 3:47 a.m., Margaret's eyes would snap open one final time to the old terror. Because soul flowing wasn't a linear journey. It was a spiral, and sometimes you had to face the darkness one more time to understand you were no longer afraid of it. Saturday, 3:47 a.m. Margaret's eyes opened in darkness, and for the first time in 63 consecutive mornings, she didn't panic. Her heart wasn't slamming. Her chest wasn't tight. Her left arm wasn't tingling. She simply woke, aware, present. The digital clock glowed red, 3:47. The number that had haunted her for months, that had sent her to the ER, that had marked every morning of her breakdown. But lying there in the pre-dawn stillness, Margaret felt something she'd never felt at this hour before. Curiosity instead of terror. What if 3:47 wasn't the enemy? What if it was never about the hour itself, but about what she'd been doing with it? Fighting it, resenting it, white-knuckling through it back to sleep so she could wake properly at 6 o'clock and start the grinding all over again. But this morning, 20-8 days into her soul-flowing practice, Margaret sat up and whispered into the darkness, "Okay, God, I'm listening. What have you been trying to say at 3:47 that I've been too afraid to hear?" She walked to the kitchen, made tea, settled into David's chair facing the window that framed only darkness. No rush to get to 5 o'clock. No anxiety about wasting time. Just being. Her phone buzzed softly. The 5 a.m. Sisters group text. Jennifer, 3:47 again, but different this time. Anyone else awake? Patricia, present, learning to welcome it instead of fight it. Linda, here, brewing coffee, feeling peace I can't explain. Sarah, Mom taught me this week 3:47 isn't the curse. It's the invitation we kept refusing. Biblical rest. Margaret was discovering at 4:13 a.m. on a Saturday in her dead husband's chair. Feels like levity without guilt. Like surrender without fear. Like the terrifying, liberating truth that you don't have to earn your oxygen. For 58 years, she'd been holding her breath, trying to deserve the next inhale through perfect performance. But soul flowing had taught her, breath is gift, not wage. Rest is nature, not reward. She wasn't resting from her calling, she was resting into it. Exactly like David had written in the final page of his journal she'd just found last night. She pulled it from the side table now. Tell Maggie this, God's rhythms don't require striving. The ocean doesn't work to flow. The moon doesn't grind to orbit. Rivers don't earn the right to run downhill. They simply flow. That's what she's been missing. We were grinding against divine current instead of releasing into it. Soul flowing is surrender to what already is, not striving toward what you hope to become. Margaret's hands trembled holding the page. He'd understood. At the end, David had finally understood, and he'd tried to leave her the roadmap home. Her phone rang at 4:47 Dr. Patel, which was odd for a Saturday pre-dawn. The doctor's voice was urgent, with something that sounded like professional confusion mixed with genuine wonder. Mrs. Robertson, I've been reviewing your 30-day follow-up results. Your cortisol levels have normalized. Your blood pressure is down 20 points. Your heart rate variability, which indicates stress resilience, is better than patients half your age. 4 weeks ago, you were on a trajectory toward cardiac crisis. Today, you're thriving. Medically, this doesn't make sense without intervention. So what's the intervention? Margaret looked at the clock, 4:52. In 8 minutes, she'd naturally transition to 5 o'clock, not because an alarm forced her, But because her body had learned the rhythm, soul flowing, she said simply, I stopped grinding against God's rhythm and started flowing with it. I stopped trying to earn rest and started receiving it. I stopped serving from exhaustion and started serving from overflow. Silence on the other end. Then, whatever that means, Mrs. Robertson, keep doing it. You just added years to your life. Margaret hung up and sat in the 4:58 a.m. darkness, watching the window begin its slow transition from black to deep purple. In 2 minutes, it would be 5 o'clock, the hour her body now naturally welcomed. She'd transformed the invitation. The 3:47 wake-up wasn't the enemy anymore. It was the early call to the 5 o'clock communion, the gateway to the soul flowing that was literally saving her life. Sunday morning, she'd return to the church parking lot where this all started 4 weeks ago. This time, she wouldn't be frozen by terror. This time, she'd walk in carrying something the congregation desperately needed but didn't know to ask for. God wasn't asking for more. He was offering less, and the women brave enough to receive it were about to discover what resurrection looks like at 58. If you're watching this at 3:47 a.m. and you are, aren't you? That's why you clicked. That's why you're still here 21 chapters into someone else's story that feels uncomfortably like your own. I need you to stop for a moment and just breathe. Put your hand on your chest. Feel your heartbeat, that racing, anxious rhythm you've learned to ignore. That's your soul keeping better time than your mind. That 3:47 a.m. wake-up isn't a curse. It's not a punishment. It's not evidence that you're broken or faithless or doing Christianity wrong. It's an invitation you've been too exhausted to recognize, too afraid to accept, too busy grinding to receive. Your body is trying to save your life by forcing you to stop before you follow the same path. Margaret almost took the path that leads to the ER, to the breakdown, to waking up at 58, wondering if you've already lived your last meaningful moment. You're not broken. Let me say that again because I know you don't believe it yet. You are not broken. You're a Christian woman over 50 who spent decades doing everything right, serving faithfully, showing up consistently, being everyone's rock, pouring yourself out until you're running on fumes, and now you're waking at 3:47 a.m. with crushing anxiety wondering where God went. But He didn't go anywhere. You did. You drifted so slowly from daughter into employee, from beloved into useful, from flowing with Him into grinding for Him that you didn't notice the switch until you were drowning. Here's the lie you've been believing: that your exhaustion is proof of your faithfulness, that your burnout is the badge of a mature woman of faith, that overcoming burnout Christian style means simply adding more prayer, more Bible study, more spiritual practices to an already crushing load. But that's not biblical rest for women. That's spiritual bypass. That's grinding with a Bible instead of a briefcase, and it will kill you just as dead. Listen to me, your 3:47 a.m. wake up is God saying, I'm here. Are you ready to stop performing and start flowing? Are you ready to trade your heavy yoke for my light one? Are you ready to discover that soul flowing isn't about being a better Christian woman over 50, it's about being a found one? You've been asking the wrong question. The question isn't, why do I feel nothing when I pray? The question is, what have I been doing that's drained everything? And the answer is grinding. Grinding for worthiness. Grinding for relevance. Grinding to prove you still matter now that your kids are grown. Your husband is gone. Your best years feel behind you. But finding purpose after 50 isn't about discovering a new job description for God. It's about rediscovering your original identity, His beloved daughter who had infinite worth before she ever lifted a finger to earn it. Tomorrow morning, or this morning, if you're brave when your eyes open at 3:47 or 4 o'clock, or whenever your soul is trying to get your attention, don't fight it, don't scroll your phone, don't panic about lost sleep, just ask, what are you saying, God? Then sit in the silence and listen. Not for an audible voice, not for a burning bush, just for the gentle invitation underneath all the noise. Come to me. Take my yoke. Mine is easy. Mine is light. Stop grinding your way to me and let me carry what you were never meant to hold. This is soul flowing, the practice of returning to rest as your foundation, not your reward. of building your morning routine with God on presence instead of productivity, of learning that biblical rest isn't optional, self-care it's oxygen for your soul. In 7 days, if you practice this just 7 days of 5 a.m. soul flowing, you'll notice something shift. Maybe it's your shoulders dropping an inch. Maybe it's spontaneous laughter. Maybe it's the first real breath you've taken in months. And if you make it to 21 days, your amygdala will rewire. Your nervous system will reset. Your life won't look different from the outside, but you'll be different on the inside. That Sunday, Margaret walked back into church after 4 weeks of soul flowing. 3 women were watching. 3 women who'd been dying the same death. And what they saw in Margaret's face, that quiet radiance, that embodied peace, made them brave enough to ask the question that would change everything. How do I learn what you're learning? 4 weeks later, 5 a.m., Ruth's living room looked like what resurrection feels like when it happens slowly, quietly, in a circle of women who almost didn't survive to see it. 5 women sat in mismatched chairs, pulled close around the coffee table. Ruth's good china, holding tea because this gathering was sacred and they all knew it. Margaret, Jennifer, Patricia, Linda, and Sarah, who'd flown in Thursday night, saying, "I can't do this by Zoom anymore. Mom, I need to be in the room where it happened." The pre-dawn darkness pressed against the windows, but inside the lamplight was warm, golden. The kind of light that makes faces look softer and true confessions feel safer. 5 Bibles lay open to different passages: Psalm 23, Matthew 11, Hebrews 4, Mark 6, John 15, the scriptures that had rebuilt each of their souls in different orders, at different paces, but toward the same truth. Soul flowing isn't a program, it's a homecoming. "I brought someone," Jennifer said quietly, glancing toward the front door where headlights had just pulled into Ruth's driveway. "My sister Rachel. She's been watching me for 3 weeks, asking what's different. Last night she called me at 3:47. She was awake, too, and I told her about the 5 a.m. sisters." The doorbell rang softly. Ruth answered, and a woman in her early 50s stood on the porch, looking terrified and hopeful in equal measure. "I don't know what I'm doing here," Rachel said, her voice shaking. "Jennifer said you're learning something about soul flowing and biblical rest for women. And I can't keep doing what I'm doing. I'm drowning." Patricia stood from her chair, walked to the door, and took Rachel's hand. "We're all drowning. That's why we're here. Come in, you're not too late." They called themselves the 5 a.m. sisters, not because they all woke naturally at 5 o'clock. Though most of them did now, their bodies recalibrated to the rhythm their souls had been starving for. They called themselves that because 5 a.m. represented the choice, to flow instead of grind, to be before doing, to receive before giving, to remember they were daughters before they were servants. Ruth led them through what she'd been practicing for 40 years. What had saved her life at 33 and was now saving theirs. The napkin diagram, the yoke exchange, the scripture anchors, the practice of sitting with God without agenda, without performance metrics, without the crushing need to turn even your morning routine with God into another task to perfect. "This is soul flowing for mature women of faith," Ruth said, her voice steady with the authority of someone who'd walked through fire and came out refined instead of consumed. "Stop grinding. Start flowing, even especially with God." 1 year later, Margaret stood in that same living room looking at what 47 women in 3 cities looked like when they chose life over slow death. The 5 a.m. sisters had multiplied. Jennifer's sister Rachel had brought to friends. Patricia's daughter had joined from Denver. Linda had started a satellite group for women from her church who were secretly dying while everyone applauded their faithfulness. Sarah had brought 3 women from her support group, and all of them had the same story. 3:47 a.m., wake-ups that felt like curses until they learned they were invitations. Chest pains that felt like punishments until they understood they were God making them lie down. Emptiness that felt like failure until they discovered it was just depletion. And depletion has a cure. Margaret looked around the room at faces that glowed with the specific radiance of women who'd stopped performing and started being. They weren't doing less, most were serving as much as before. But they were doing it differently, flowing instead of grinding, giving from fullness instead of fumes. showing up as human instead of superhuman. This is what spiritual productivity actually looks like when it's rooted in soul, flowing, not frantic activity, but purposeful presence, not grinding yourself to dust to prove you matter, but flowing from the source, who already decided you matter before you lifted a finger. Your 3:47 a.m. is calling. It's been calling for weeks, months, maybe years. And now you have a choice. Keep fighting it. Keep grinding through it. Keep white-knuckling your way to collapse. Or answer it. Sit with it. Let it be the invitation to soul flowing that transforms your final decades from survival into the sacred second act God always intended. The 5 a.m. sisters are waiting. The rhythm is ready. The question is simple. Will you stop grinding and start flowing? Even with God, especially with God. Let's go back to where we started. Margaret at 58, frozen in a church parking lot, unable to move. Her body staging a rebellion her mind refused to acknowledge. The clock reading 3:47 a.m. for the 47th consecutive morning. The visit with Dr. Patel's 90-day deadline hanging like a countdown timer. The terrifying prayer that sounded like giving up, but was actually the beginning of waking up. That Sunday she couldn't get out of the car that was day zero. The moment when grinding finally broke her gears completely. And in the breaking, soul flowing could finally begin. 90 days. That's all it took. 90 days of choosing soul, flowing over grinding. 90 days of 5 a.m. mornings, sitting with God before serving for God. 90 days of practicing the yoke exchange, giving Him her crushing weight, taking His easy burden. 90 days of learning that biblical rest for women isn't optional self-care, it's oxygen for your soul. 90 days of rewiring her amygdala from panic to peace, her nervous system from fight or flight to rest and digest, her entire identity from God's employee back to His beloved daughter. From the church parking lot where she broke to the garden where Sarah found her glowing. From the ER with heart symptoms to Dr. Patel's shocked call. You just added years to your life. From grinding herself toward David's grave, to discovering her sacred second act was waiting on the other side of surrender. That's what 90 days of soul flowing looks like. Not perfection. Transformation. Not becoming someone new. Becoming yourself again, the woman God created before decades of grinding convinced you that your worth was measured in productivity. From 3:47 a.m. terror, to 5 a.m. communion. From chest pains to quiet radiance. From the invisible 85% who are secretly dying to the visible remnant who chose to live. Margaret's story isn't unique, it's epidemic. And the cure isn't more Bible study or better time management or positive thinking. The cure is soul flowing, the rhythm Jesus modeled, the rest God commands, the exchange that saves your life.